This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, Sampath. On January 20th, Donald Trump will officially take charge as America's president for the second time. There's a lot of speculation and also apprehension around what to expect from his administration. Will there be, for instance, mass deportations on an unprecedented scale? Will we see a new tariff war as he raises import tariffs across the board? How will he deal with China and Iran in his second term? And will he break with the Biden foreign policy with regard to Europe, Ukraine, and the Middle East? And what are the challenges and opportunities for India specifically? In this episode, we try and bring you a detailed overview of all these questions of Trump's agenda and expected policy moves in these areas. And we are joined by Suhasini Haidar, the Hindu's diplomatic affairs editor. Suhasini, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to In Focus.
Really, thanks for having me on to discuss this issue, which I think so many are wondering about.
So, Suhasini, I'll start with a theme that was central to Trump's election campaign, which was immigration. And unlike his first term, this time he also has more control over the trifecta of institutions. So I wanted to know what's your sense in terms of what he will actually be able to do or want to do as opposed to all the scary rhetoric we've heard during his campaign. Are we going to see mega detention centers? Will we see kids being separated from their parents as we saw in his previous term? Will we see undocumented migrants indiscriminately rounded up and deported to Mexico or wherever? So what is your take on this entire question, which is on everybody's mind?
Well, certainly one of the key, as you said, key aspects of Trump's campaign promises had been to be really tough on immigration. And as a result, particularly in India, there is a certain worry. One thing we should be clear about is it's not as if the Biden administration was not getting tougher and tougher on illegal immigration and, in fact, closing some of the avenues for legal immigration as well. This is obviously an issue which has become an emotive issue in the United States, with people worrying about their jobs going away or about crime going up because of illegal immigrants or regularly immigrant populations growing in those in the United States. And we see it in other countries of the West as well. Trump has been very clear that he will not only be tough, he expects to hit the floor running. As soon as he becomes president, he has already announced that he wants to pass a number of executive orders, clearing the way for his immigration czar, as he's called, Tom Homan, who has already put out a few what sound like outlandish ideas, a tip-off line where anyone can call in and say, we think there's an illegal immigrant here, and the Department of Immigration, ICE, Homeland Security can get involved in that. But remember that over the last few years, Europe, month upon month, the US has already been deporting large numbers of people. In June, I think in October this last year, they'd said that in the matter of maybe 4 months or 5 months, they had returned or deported more than 150,000 individuals. Many of those were to India as well. There were deportation flights to India that have been documented in the last few months, but also over the last few years. So certainly expect that there will be some demonstrative deportations. Trump coming in will want to show that his border czar is really getting tough and is going to send back tens of thousands of illegal immigrants. How that plays out when it comes, to legal immigration, particularly when it comes to the skill sets the US needs people for, like engineers, really remains to be seen. And you may have seen that in the last few weeks, the real fight has broken out within the MAGA camp itself, Trump's Make America Great Again camp itself, between people like Elon Musk on one side and Vivek Ramaswamy, as well as others who have been very critical of the idea that there is a need to bring in legal immigrants, particularly for the tech industry. So we've seen other Trump advisors like Steve Bannon taking them on quite strongly. So it remains to be seen what happens when it comes to immigration, particularly in those fields where the US.
How do you see this? How do you see this affecting Indian IT workers who have their whole visa quotas and all that stuff going on?
Well, Sampath, to begin with, the first question is, are those visas quotas going to continue? Is the H-1B system going to be overhauled? Because that is something even Vivek Ramaswamy has said, and he's, of course, part of the Department of Government Efficiency now, along with Elon Musk, that they want to see a whole overhaul of that visa quota system. He says the lottery system is just patently unfair, and that he wants to see a new system there. So the first question is the US now going to completely overhaul this system, which has been working, and Indians have been, such a large part of that program. They're the highest number of visa applicants, as well as, winning those lotteries quite often. The second question is going to be, what is it going to mean for ancillary visa quotas, including for the spouses? Because in his first term, Trump had come down quite hard, changed the kind of facilities available to H-1B spouses. So the second question is going to be really, how will it affect other visa categories? I think the third is really the one that affects Indians on an emotional sphere, which is, what is this constant haranguing of immigrants and bringing immigrants in to the US? What does it really do to the kind of atmosphere for Indians wishing to immigrate to the US? And I think there we have already seen in the first Trump term certain changes. The numbers of those applying for universities, for example, the growth in those actually slowed, in indicating that there's a little less comfort with a Trumpian era of immigration. But I think that last question does trouble many, because it doesn't matter then whether we're talking about legal immigration or illegal immigration. It's just, is a Trumpian era less friendly to Indian immigrants?
Right. I mean, thank you for that explanation, sort of a broad outline of this immigration scenario, Suhasini. I mean, I think this distinction between legal and illegal migrants, I think, is going to be one of the fault lines, perhaps, within the Republican camp, as you sort of pointed towards it. Staying on this broad terrain of immigration and its related theme of economic nationalism, which has gone with this immigration rhetoric and program. I mean, Trump has said that one of his favorite words, the favorite word in the dictionary, is tariff. And and keeping with economic nationalism and protectionism, he has promised across the board tariffs of 10 to 20% on everything America imports. So, is it realistically something he will do? Because it could lead to a lot of backlash. It could lead to a tariff war, or is it going to be something specific that he will use as leverage with big importers like India and China?
Like everything else Mr. Trump promises, one, A, does not know how strongly he's going to pursue it. B, whether, when it boomerangs or when there is a backlash to some of these policies. If you remember, when he first came to power, that whole idea of quote unquote a Muslim ban, a ban on flights and immigrants coming from certain countries around the world, he faced pushback pretty instantly, and then had to change his policy. Now, when it comes to tariffs, you're quite right. He's made it clear that he loves the word tariffs, that he hopes to be a tariff president. He has just in the last couple of days, and this is in the lead up to his own inaugural, already announced the plan for an external revenue service. So instead of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, Trump wants the External Revenue Service. He wants to put people apparently in charge of getting taxes from abroad, or imposing tariffs on other countries, and how he will benefit from that. Obviously, he has called China the worst offender and has promised 60% tariffs against China on any kind of exports into the United States. But he's also called India a major violator of tariffs. and said that he will match India measure for measure on any tariffs that they see. And this was a theme even in his first term. Despite the fact that people think that India's relations with the US really did improve during Mr. Trump's first tenure, there were specific areas on tariffs, on his withdrawal of India's GSP status for exporters, for example, on the kind of WTO cases that he slapped against India, on a number of areas where he felt that India had not withdrawn its tariffs and therefore he slapped new tariffs. So on those issues, it was always a little tough going with Mr. Trump, and it's likely to be the same this time around. If you remember, one of the biggest news points, if you like, during Mr. Trump's first tenure was his insistence that India should cancel all duties on the import of Harley-Davidson motorbikes. Now, this was something Mr. Trump said maybe in his second term in office, second month in office in 2017, and it became a running theme. He would call up Prime Minister Modi, then he would announce to the press that he had told Prime Minister Modi that the tariff numbers should come down. At one point, India actually did agree to taking down the tariffs by as much as 70%. But then Mr. Trump went on television again and said, no, this was not good enough. In fact, he practically mimicked Prime Minister Modi saying, we'll do this for you, and saying, no, but that's not good enough for me. I want zero tariffs on this Harley-Davidson motorbike. And that became a kind of case in point. Harley-Davidson subsequently actually shut down its operations in India for a while. Then it came in collaboration with an Indian manufacturer, and now sells a very lower end motorbike in India rather than the ones they were selling earlier. To your larger question of what kind of impact Mr. Trump's plans for tariffs on the world will have, the first obvious impact, especially when it comes to imports from China, is going to be the inflationary aspect. Many have said that he may wreck China's manufacturing export for a while, but he is going to increase inflation so much inside the United States that.
So wouldn't that hit his own constituency hard? I mean, the white
Absolutely.
working classes wouldn't be hit hard by this?
Absolutely. And in fact, Mr. Trump, one of the reasons he won was because Mr. Biden was seen as an inflationary president, wrongly or rightly, because many felt that actually inflation had come down during Mr. Biden's tenure. But this is something, as I said, I saw someone refer to Mr. Trump really as an intellectual Roomba, saying essentially he goes with a policy until he hits a block. And then you see him react to that. So we're not actually sure whether there's going to be this large amount of planning behind some of these proposals. Of course, in this tenure, he is coming in fully prepared in terms of his team. So as soon as we get into the post-inaugural phase, you're already seeing the Senate confirmation hearings for many of his nominees take place. You will see Mr. Trump's team ready to go. The question is really going to be how much is he going to be able to run on rhetoric in terms of saying, this is something I'd planned and this is something I'm going to go full throttle on.
So does his team give, like the team composition gives any kind of hints on, are they all tariff warriors and, hawks on migration, illegal migrants and those kinds of others? Are those the kinds of appointees that he's going with? Do they give us some clues about how much of the rhetoric is going to translate into reality?
Oh, I think so. I think, when he has chosen Tom Homan, for example, as his border czar, as he calls him, this is someone who's going to be extremely tough, who has been tough in the past on, sort of prosecutions of illegal immigrants. When he looks at his appointees, when it comes to the economic side, we're seeing a number of appointees who essentially, while are also going to be completely on side with him, aligned with him on the tariff question, in general are also particularly tough on China and the need to curb imports from China. So you're seeing a number of his nominees, and I think there are dozens now of nominees that he has already announced We're waiting to see, of course, in India, who he will announce as the ambassador to India. But when you look in terms of labor, when you look in terms of his Medicare nominees that he has announced, agriculture, commerce is Howard Lutnick, somebody who is extremely aligned with him on these issues. I think what you should expect is a little bit of the past, which we know, which is Mr. Trump will want to match all tariffs measure for measure, and in fact, possibly double the response on any. B, that he is going to be transactional. In other words, that it is possible for countries to cut deals with him when it comes to, for example, in the last tenure, we saw India buying a lot more energy from the US and thus staving off some of the countermeasures that he had planned. The third, that he will leverage every bit of US industry in order to, his ability to sort of put pressure on other countries, to also take in American exports, to also try and manufacture in the United States. Before we saw the case with Mr. Adani, for example, we actually saw an announcement by Mr. Adani that he welcomed Trump coming to power in the United States and said, I hope to put at least $10 billion into the United States in terms of investments. We've seen the Tatas and the Mahindras in the past as well.
Adani, sorry to interrupt, Suhasini, on this Adani question, just before we move on to the next aspect, I just wanted to know your thoughts on this whole enforcement of corporate governance issues, this FCPA in particular. When there is some speculation that he's going to sort of drive the Department of Justice and other areas, this hardcore crime and immigration and so on, and not going to be as hard as perhaps the Biden administration was with regard to FCPA crimes and so on. Do you get that sense, or it's not something he's going to be involved in, or his administration is going to be involved in directly?
No, I think you're right. I think Mr. Trump has in the past also said that he does not understand why the US needs to prosecute corporates for crimes they commit outside the United States. He has in fact said that this actually works against the US because it loses the US contracts as a result. So when it comes to some of those Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as you were referring to it, he's unlikely to perhaps be as tough or, as sort of proactive maybe as the Biden administration was. However, as I said, this is Mr. Trump is transactional to the core. So if he is going to give anything on those issues, you can expect that he will also want something in return, an announcement of investment or jobs being offshored back to the United States, or some kind of a collaboration of that sort.
Right. Now, I want to sort of go on to this big, I think, subject which I think a lot of listeners would be really interested in, which is the entire foreign policy aspect. And I also think if the entire world should have some kind of vote on the US presidential election, because the US president's actions are going to be affecting everybody on the planet. But I want to start with the immediate neighborhood before we sort of go beyond that, which is his policy towards his neighbors, again dictated by his twin obsessions of immigration and economic kind of tariffs, and countries, especially those which enjoy a trade surplus with the US, he wants to go after them. And he has said things like he's going to use military force to acquire Greenland and the Panama Canal, and he will use economic force to annex Canada. I mean, is it just like playing to the galleries, or is there some kind of a method in this crazy rhetoric?
Well, clearly there is some method in Mr. Trump's mind as to why he has decided to get so openly aggressive towards his neighbors. With Canada, he continuously, while Mr. Trudeau was still, before he had announced that he would be stepping down, went on about Canada becoming the 51st state of the US. Mr. Trudeau even went to Florida to meet Mr. Trump. And despite that, we saw the memes and the sort of mocking of Mr. Trudeau as the governor of a US state. As you said, he has now said he wants to somehow acquire Greenland. Of course, this is an old issue. Greenland has been very desired by the US, and the idea that just as they purchased Alaska, that Greenland would be a great asset to have in terms of not just its positioning between the US and Russia, in terms of its oil resources and gas resources, as well as the opening up of Arctic routes and trade routes. And Mr. Trump certainly has his eye on that as well. Whether he's going to go through with it or not remains to be seen. We've already seen Denmark object quite strenuously. We've already heard Greenland say it's really not up for sale. Similarly with the Panama Canal, and you're right that there is a kind of almost coordinated push in the neighborhood to show that the United States remains a boss. It compares a little bit to his first term, where again, he wanted to come down on both Mexico and Canada for trade, and actually put aside the NAFTA treaty between the US, Canada, and Mexico, but then agreed to negotiate another deal called USMCA with them. So as you're perhaps hinting over there, a little bit of this is essentially very strong rhetoric in order to bring the other side to the talking table and perhaps to cut a new deal that he can put his imprint on and is not something that he says is a legacy of the past.
And moving beyond the neighborhood, where his explicit aggressiveness is quite visible. I mean, there are also a lot of reports now about overt US interference. With what may have been covert in the past, we don't know, but there is overt interference in the domestic politics of EU countries, especially with his good friend Elon Musk donating millions of dollars to far-right groups. He's doing that in the UK. He's mainstreaming AFD in Germany. So do you think this kind of thing is now going to be like a part of mainstream part of US foreign policy as such? This kind of interference, which I don't think is going to be much appreciated in Europe.
Well, the truth is that we need to see how far Mr. Trump is actually backing what Mr. Musk has done over the last few weeks. It began with the UK, if you remember, where Mr. Musk became a very strong critic of the Keir Starmer government. He wants Mr. Starmer to resign. He used first what is called the grooming gang scandal over there against Starmer, but also talked about the illegal immigrants that were being allowed into the UK to say the UK deserves a new government, even though the UK has only just elected Mr. Starmer and elected the Labour Party with a very, very large mandate. And then, as you pointed out, there's a lot of rhetoric about Germany, about France, clearly not about Mr. Trump's closer allies, if you like the Italian Prime Minister or the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. So the first question is, how much is Mr. Trump backing this, or is he just simply looking away as Mr. Musk goes after these various governments in the EU? And who knows what is actually going to be the ask from the United States' point of view on those. I think the second question that has to be asked is the US, in a sense, now guilty of just what they have been accusing Russia and China of doing? This is this kind of electoral interference in their country. And that is going to become a big wedge in the side of in the relationship across the Atlantic in particular, if that is the case. I think the third really that has to be asked is if Mr. Trump is going to put this kind of strain on his relationship with Europe. You're already seeing the kind of strain coming from things like you mentioned about Greenland, where he spoke about Greenland or the Panama Canal. And many asking if Mr. Trump is looking to, in some way, aggressively talk about other territory that does not belong to the US. Why should, on what basis can the West then criticize Russia for what it did in Ukraine? And really, should China be eyeing Taiwan in quite the same way? So in a sense, Mr. Trump's comments that you were speaking about are not just about causing bilateral tensions. It could change the entire way that people put an emphasis on this rules-based order, on the idea of sovereignty. If the US can do it, then other countries might say, well, in my neighborhood, I can behave in a similar way.
Right. I mean, if in his previous term, Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord, as in he withdrew US from the Paris Accord. Maybe he wants to withdraw from the rules-based world order. We don't know if that is going to be something which might
Sampath,
happen.
sorry, remember, he didn't just walk out of the Paris Accord. He walked out of the JCPOA agreement with Iran, so an agreement the US had brokered. He walked out of UN organizations like UNESCO, UNHCR. He threatened to walk out of NATO. He threatened to walk out of WTO. He now wants to walk out of WHO, the World Health Organization, as well. So the fact is, he is letting it be known that he is not bound by any of these rules that the US used to call the rules-based order.
Is this like something we need to sort of prepare for this withdrawal? Is this really a withdrawal of the US in terms of its capacity to influence global politics? Is it becoming more insular, or is it just a self-serving kind of a move so that it can do whatever it likes?
Well, in the beginning, actually, what we have seen is it increases Mr. Trump's influence, regardless of how you put it, Sampath. In the last few months, we have seen many countries really trying to reach out to Mr. Trump and forge a decent relationship with him right at the start. As I mentioned, the Canadian Prime Minister already made that trip. Other prime ministers, Japan and others, the Indonesian president, have all tried to reach out to Mr. Trump, try to meet him early. India, you can tell, is equally a little bit, I think the nervousness is a little palpable. If you see, the External Affairs Minister will be going to Washington for Mr. Trump's inaugural, and it'll really be the third time in 6 months that the Indian Foreign Minister is there in the US. So clearly there is a desire to at least start off the Trump era, Trump 2.0 era, if you like, with a good relationship, with a base relationship with the US. But you're quite right that in the long term, the question starts being asked, if the US is not going to be a leader in terms of how it behaves, and it is not going to be able to stand up for others, in other words, is only really standing up for itself, will it lose influence in the long term? Is there going to be a decline in the US's influence? And I think many are sort of suggesting that 4 years of Mr. Trump in the past has had a detrimental effect on the US's image, if you like.
Right. You spoke about different leaders wanting to meet Trump, and also how Trump's own influence seems to be sort of increasing, perhaps at the cost of the institutional influence of the United States machine, so to speak. Now, in this context, I think Russia, has been making pretty positive noises about engaging with Trump in person, towards finding peace in Ukraine, ending the Ukraine war. Do you think Trump will be more successful in sort of finding some kind of a peaceful resolution to the conflict there compared to the Biden administration?
When it comes to Russia, I think this has been the most anticipated outcome of a Trump win for the past year, at least. During the Biden tenure, it became very clear that if Trump were to come to power, he would expect to see a deal between Russia and Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin, fairly early in his tenure. He said he would only take 24 hours to do this. As soon as he got elected, we already saw things move in terms of the German chancellor calling up Putin, Mr. Zelensky saying that he expected to see some kind of a diplomatic outcome in the next year. I think the position we're at with the Ukraine war, and you can already hear how the rhetoric has really gone down both in Europe and the US, is that in the immediate aftermath of Mr. Trump coming to power is the US will no longer be funding the Ukraine military in the way it has been. That Mr. Trump has made very clear. The second part, as you said, is about a Trump-Putin meeting. And Mr. Trump, too, has said that he hopes to meet Mr. Putin fairly early in his tenure. So all eyes will really be on that. Remember, Mr. Putin is expected here in India in the first, at least, quarter of this year for an annual summit. That could become a place where Mr. Modi has some kind of a role in trying to bring some talks about. We certainly expect to see then the next phase, which is of a ceasefire. As we hear today about the likelihood of a ceasefire in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas coming closer, Mr. Trump has sent his envoy over there. It's quite likely that we will also see that ceasefire in the Ukraine conflict. The question is really going to be, how will Europe react to it? Is Europe going to continue the war? Is it going to increase its funding to Ukraine? And how that will play out. But I think for the moment, it seems fairly clear that Mr. Trump is not going to want to see this war continue.
Right. On this Europe wanting to do things its own way vis-a-vis the Ukraine situation. I mean, I think recently there was a meeting of certain European Union leaders on what to do if Trump were to sort of try to pull the plug on this entire funding of Ukraine business. So do you think there is a chance that Trump may not be able to do much if the European countries were to decide to sort of together back Ukraine, and in that scenario the Ukraine war might continue despite whatever Trump and
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by the Hindu.
Without the US's backing is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to pose that counteroffensive to Russia. And remember, let's look at the situation there on the ground. Since 2022 till now, and it's nearly 3 years since that conflict began and Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukrainian forces have not been able to dislodge Russian forces from the positions largely that they took 3 years ago. In order to do that, it is clear that they will need a huge escalation, a ramping up of the support it has and of the firepower it has, its abilities against the Russian military. And I think that is going to be difficult to make up if the US bows out of this. The European countries have, you're quite right, have been announcing that they will step up their defense spending to more than 2% as a part of the GDP. In fact, most European countries now, I think in the EU, are actually above 2% of their GDP being put aside for defense. But the question is that going to be something that they will part with for Ukraine, or is it essentially going to remain a self-defense kind of mechanism? Because obviously many countries are about what Russia could even think about doing next. So I think what will really matter is what Mr. Zelensky plans to do next. Is he going to be in a position where he will accept a ceasefire discussion of some sort? Because so far, all his positions have been that it is illegal to have any kind of negotiation with Mr. Putin. And he has certainly said that any ceasefire would only take place after Russia actually pulled away from the positions it had taken. So I think the ball will now really go into Mr. Zelensky's court as to what he plans to do next.
Right. I mean, as you rightly put, I think it will be very difficult for Ukraine and for the Europe to sort of continue things without like adequate support from the Trump administration going forward, and how that works out remains to be seen. We're running out of time, Suhasini. One last question on perhaps the most important sub-theme of the U.S. foreign policy now, which is the situation, the crisis in West Asia, the war in Gaza. We have read reports of some kind of a deal being discussed, which Hamas seems to have accepted. But we also know that Trump has not had very charitable things to say about the Israeli president in recent times. We don't know. I mean, he is someone we know works with personal one-on-one kind of equations. And given the nature of his equation with Netanyahu, what do you think are the chances that we will find some kind of a sustainable peace in West Asia. Also, given the fact that we know that he perhaps his dislike for Iran is far greater than that whatever his recent dislike of Netanyahu might be.
Sure. And before I speak about the Israel Hamas situation, I certainly do think that Mr. Trump will come back with maximum pressure on Iran, because that is an old part of his policy. And just as he forced India to cancel all its oil imports from Iran in the first term, he's likely to put pressure on anyone doing business with Iran in his second term as well. But when it comes to Israel, you're right. He has often said that he's not a fan of Mr. Netanyahu per se. But I think the support to Israel and to its claims has been far more than the U.S. policy itself has been in the past. For example, on moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I think what we're likely to see, and Mr. Trump's made it clear that he wants to see a ceasefire immediately. He has already sent Stephen Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, to the region, who has been traveling in the region, meeting with all of them, including going to Qatar, including speaking to Mr. Netanyahu in Tel Aviv, and trying to forge a deal of some sort, which we could see announced in the next few days, if not weeks. We're told that a deal for at least 33 hostages to be released could come very close to Mr. Trump's inaugural. And I think that's the kind of image he wants to put out there, that he can fix this, that the first thing he's going to do is that the hostages must be freed and that there must be a ceasefire. I can tell you that Israeli officials have been saying for the last few months that they are prepared now to get into another phase when it comes to Gaza. After all, if you look at the pictures, there is no, there's very little of Gaza that Israel has not bombarded already or destroyed. More than 45,000 people dead. But there is a sense that some of those offensive operations now may be put on a lower boil, if you like.
Right. I think there also might be some kind of, I don't know, a bombing fatigue. I mean, it looks like Israel has perhaps worked itself into a ceasefire because there is nothing more to flatten in Gaza.
Correct. And really it remains to be seen now as what happens in the next phase. Who will govern Gaza? Who will be allowed to send their troops in there? Will there be some kind of an Arab force that gets in there, or the United Nations? But the future of Gaza now is going to be a much bigger issue for 2025 than simply about stopping the bombardment and a ceasefire.
Right. Thank you so much, Suhasini. I think we've sort of roughly covered the broad policy agenda, policy domains of the new Trump administration, coming in from immigration to trade wars to US, the immediate neighborhood, the Ukraine situation, Gaza. I think broadly we know that I think the Trump administration, for everything said and done, is going to be an action-packed kind of a 4-year period. I think every week we're going to see some new thing happening, if nothing else, some statement that is going to have everybody going and Googling stuff, if not more.
And remember,
thank you so.
The real question is going to be, how soon is he going to meet with President Xi Jinping? He already put out an invitation to the Chinese president to come for his inauguration. He's not coming for that, but he's sending some officials. But really, all eyes are going to be on how Mr. Trump, who is himself a China hawk, who has appointed so many China hawks, how he's really going to tackle China, not just on the trade question, but of course on the strategic question, the Indo-Pacific as well.
Right. I think China is one big theme which requires a podcast to its own, especially Trump and Xi meeting and their equation. Maybe we'll come to that in another episode. Thank you so much once again for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and insights on the second Trump administration. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sampath.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.